Tonight we're going to be led through an exploration of the third largest economy in the world, the second largest in the developed world, as you will be hearing from Sir David Warren. And there could hardly be anybody better qualified to join us here this evening to talk about that. A distinguished former ambassador, or I might say once an ambassador, always an ambassador, Sir David is now chairman of the very prestigious Japan Society, which many of you will know. He was our ambassador to Japan from 2008 to 2012, having served twice before in the British Embassy in Tokyo during his career with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, from 1977 to 1981 in the Economic Department, and 1993 to 1998 as Commercial Councillor. He was head of the Foreign Office's China-Hong Kong Department from 1998 to 2000, and a member of the Foreign Office's Board of Management as Director of Human Resources from 2004 to 2007. So there are a lot of people in the Foreign Office about whom he knows a great deal. He retired from the Foreign Office in January 2013 and is now, quite apart from being chairman of Japan Society, visiting professor at Sheffield and De Montfort universities, and chairman of the Council of the University of Kent. He is also a member of the advisory board of Migration Matters, the campaigning group highlighting the benefits of legal migration. You might want to ask him a question about visas, perhaps. Anyway, we are absolutely delighted to have Sir David Warren with us tonight. The form is that he will talk to us for 20 minutes, half an hour or so. Then we'll have Q&A. And then when you're thoroughly exhausted or we run out of time, we'll repair to the room in which you were having tea and coffee and offer you something slightly stronger to refresh you. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir David Warren. David.
Roddy, thank you very much indeed for that extremely kind and generous welcome. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I was very encouraged to hear about the aggression with which your last speaker, Lord Desai, started his appearance before you, because I always suspect, whenever I speak to an audience, that I'm speaking to people who know as much, if not more, about the subject than I do. And I know there will be people here this evening maybe learning about Japan for the first time, but there will be a lot of people here this evening who know, who have experienced Japan, who've had a deep interest in Japan for many years. I want to talk tonight in addressing the theme of Japan's place in the 21st century world, about Japan in 2014, its economic power, which Roddy has described, which remains substantial, its political profile, both in terms of its domestic politics and its international profile, which is perhaps lower than one would expect of an economy of this size and importance. Its international relationships, particularly its problematical relationships in the region with its nearest neighbours, its alliance with the United States, and its attitudes towards Europe and the UK in particular, and to speculate briefly about some of the underlying cultural issues which may affect all those questions. In talking about culture, I'm always very conscious of, nervous about, making cultural generalizations, because I think generalizations are very dangerous. One of my much more distinguished predecessors as ambassador, Sir Sidney Giffard, who was ambassador in the 1980s, once started a lecture by saying, "I never begin a sentence with the words, 'the Japanese are,' without thinking of half a dozen of my Japanese friends to whom the generalization does not apply." That applies to all countries and all nationalities. It applies as much to Japan, however much we think of Japan as a socially cohesive society, as it does to other countries. Very well, Japan's place in the 21st century world. Maybe we should just start with a little potted history of its place in the 19th and 20th century worlds to give us a flavour of the way in which Japan has developed. A highly developed society which sealed itself off from the world for nearly 250 years until the United States and the other treaty powers, of which the United Kingdom was one, forcibly opened Japan to foreign trade and to foreign influence in the mid-19th century. Of course, Japan was not quite as hermetically sealed from the world as we like to think. it was tracking quite closely what was going on in the rest of the world, and there is a sizable body of historians who believe that the Japanese waiting for the United States black ships to appear in 1853 had a better idea of what was going on in America through their access to books written in Dutch, translated into Japanese, that came through the free port which Dutch traders used near Nagasaki, than the Americans did of what was happening in Japan. Nonetheless, Japan opened up, and after a period of intense civil unrest in the 1850s and 60s, culminating in the restoration of Emperor Meiji, it became, in short order, a powerful industrial force in the world, and indeed began to assemble its own empire in successful imitation of the other imperial powers. And it became a powerful industrial force in the world through its young intellectuals and administrators touring the world and eclectically taking from America, from Britain, from France, from Germany, the best of those societies and transplanting them into Japanese society with extraordinary success. It became not only a rising empire and industrial force, but it became a model for other Asian countries. When the Japanese Imperial Navy destroyed and sank the Russian Imperial Navy at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, it was a model for other Asian powers who dreamed of throwing off the imperialist yokes under which they had to live. There's a telling anecdote of the young Nehru, later leader of India, on a train from Dover to his school at Harrow, reading in the newspaper of the Japanese defeat of the Russian Imperial Navy and beginning to believe that Asia could begin to rise again. Japan was a role model for other Asian countries. But in the first half of the 20th century, as we all know, that became a nightmare as the military took effective power of a weakened Japanese democracy, and the spiral towards the physical and moral catastrophe of the Second World War took place, and the effective destruction of Japan in 1945 as a functioning society, let alone as an empire or an industrial power. Japan recovered from that cataclysm effectively as a colony of the United States of America during the period of the US occupation, and then under US under the oversight of the US, I suppose one can say. These historical movements are pretty complex, so I'm generalizing wildly. But under the oversight of the US, it began the process of rebuilding its economy and becoming an economic force in the world, while the United States assumed responsibility for its defense as part of its defense of the region of East Asia. A deal enshrined in the 1960 alliance between the United States and Japan on peace and security. And behind the American protection of the nuclear umbrella, Japan's economy grew in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s until Japan became the second most powerful economy in the world and was confidently expected to overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world, until the bubble burst at the end of the 1980s, and Japan began again its long period of effective economic stagnation, through which, in a sense, Japan is still living nearly 25 years after the bursting of the bubble. One of the striking things about Japan, in my experience, and as Roddy said, I've lived in Japan for over 13 years in all. I spent 3 tours of duty there in the British Embassy in the 70s when Japan was growing, in the 90s, the lost decade after the bubble had burst, and then again, more recently as ambassador, is the way in which Japan, and I hope those Japanese here tonight will not be offended if I generalize in this way, remains an extraordinarily self-conscious country. It is a country which is fascinated and intrigued by the way in which it is perceived in the world. When I talk to Japanese audiences, particularly of Japanese students in the UK, often the first question I'm asked is, what does the world think of Japan? There's a great self-consciousness in the Japanese psyche. At the same time, there is, at least when I was there, certainly as ambassador, and I think it was there for some years before that, a deep sense of unhappiness that, in a way, Japan is no longer taken as seriously as other Asian countries that are growing much faster, that it is being overtaken, obviously, by China, increasingly by other East Asian industrial tigers, and that after a period in which Japan was thought to be rising, it is now a country that is being surpassed by others, and it is, in a sense, missing from the international fraternity. And Japanese tend to attribute this phenomenon to a constant failure of Japanese political leadership. I found when I was ambassador, and I used to entertain large numbers of British politicians and British officials and commentators who would come to Japan to conduct bilateral business, to learn about what was happening in Japan. I would gather them around the ambassadorial lunch or dinner table. I would get commentators in, Japanese politicians, and we'd talk about Japan. I would find that the conversation from the Japanese was often extraordinarily depressing, miserable, self-critical. Why are we so useless? Why are we failing as a society? Why are our young people so lacking in get up and go? Why are our politicians so pathetic and unable to lead? Why is the rest of the world kicking sand in our face? There was this terrible sense of depression and despair. And it was often left to me and a lot of the British observers to say, but Japan is still seen as a role model by so many countries in terms of the success of its society, in many ways, in terms of its continuing economic growth, even at a time of international economic difficulty, because although it has been economically stagnant for 20 years or so, it has continued to grow, albeit at slightly insipid rates during that period. And in many ways, Japan remains an extraordinarily attractive society in which to live, and a comfortable and, in terms of social cohesiveness, a successful society. But the iron is in the soul for many Japanese, and this sense of failure was all-pervasive. To a degree, that led to the overturning of the Liberal Democratic Party, the party which had governed Japan effectively for nearly 50 years, over 50 years in fact, in the elections of 2009, and the election of the opposition party, the Democratic Party of Japan, who were in power for most of my time as ambassador. This was a terrible disaster in political terms, because the DPJ proved to be no less faction-ridden than the party they had replaced. Their prime ministers were not strong. They had to deal with the terrible disaster of the earthquake and tsunami in the Tohoku region in 2011, followed by the meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear reactor, and their ability as a government, their ability as a party to cope with all these problems proved sadly lacking. And just after I left as ambassador at the end of 2012, in the general election which was finally called, the Liberal Democrats came back into power, not with a massive vote of confidence, but it was a clear vote against the DPJ, who were effectively reduced to a rump of MPs. And Shinzo Abe became Prime Minister for the second time. His first period in the middle of the previous decade had been pretty unsuccessful. He'd had to resign from ill health. He now came back, a new man, and he came back with a commitment to an economic policy, Abenomics as it's called, which was designed at least to inject some momentum into Japan and to kickstart the economy into action again. That's, in a sense, where I want to start my very quick tour of what's happening in Japan. We'll talk about the economics first, and then on to the politics, which we won't dwell on for too long, because if I dwelt there for too long, it would get very complicated and depressing, and then talk a little bit about Japan in the region. Abenomics. There are three elements to Abenomics which the Prime Minister has announced. One is fiscal flexibility, which the Japanese have always used in order to kickstart, to spend out of recession. More importantly, a monetary stimulus, because he has a governor of the Bank of Japan who is prepared to inject as much money as it takes to keep the economy not only afloat but growing, to depress the long-term bond market, and to move as much of those assets as possible out of bonds into the stock market to get a bit more risk and growth into the Japanese economy. The third arrow, which is proving the most difficult for Abe to fire, is sometimes described as the need to deregulate the economy, because although Japan has relatively few overt barriers to trade now, it is still a very highly regulated economy. Those regulations designed often to avert all possible risk in any economic transaction in any field have a terribly depressing effect upon trade and international trade. And so there's quite a lot of pressure from Japan's trading partners to remove them, but there's an even greater pressure from within Japanese industry to tackle this network of regulations and to free up a lot of activity, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. And tackling that is proving tough because there are a lot of vested interests that need to be addressed. Some of this is being done through international free trade negotiations, but Japanese farmers, who represent a tiny proportion of the economy, but a tremendously influential political constituency within the Liberal Democrats, are proving very resistant. There is, I think, a fear that although Abe and his government are committed to this three-arrow policy, it is beginning to bear fruit very slowly, and the shine is beginning to come off this policy so that people become a little disillusioned, a little sceptical about whether it will really succeed in lifting the growth rate and the inflation rate, because Japan has been effectively in deflation for the last 20 years, to the 1.52% that Abe and the governor of the Bank of Japan have committed themselves to. There are friends of Japan and informed commentators in Britain who say it is unrealistic to expect Japan's economy to grow to this degree. Japan is a highly developed and sophisticated economy. It has a demographic which is quite scary because the population is over the long term shrinking. By the middle of this century, 40% of a reduced population. It's about 125 million at the moment. It'll be about 95 million by 2050. 40% of those will be over the age of 65. It's very hard to expect an economy with that demographic profile to grow at the level that Abe has committed himself to, and certainly completely unrealistic to expect Japan to match the growth rates happening in East Asia, in many of which countries, of course, have a similarly scary demographic. Indeed, Korea and Taiwan have lower fertility rates than Japan. So there are skeptics about whether Abenomics can really work. In the sense that it has worked, it's injected a higher degree of confidence. So you find now, talking to Japanese, a little bit more vim and oomph that the country can be made to pull itself out of the slough of despond. And although we talk about Japanese economic failure, we have to remember that Japan is still a mighty economic force. 13% of the Fortune 500 top companies are Japanese. Much of the world's cutting-edge research and development is done in Japan, in universities and by the major companies. It is a massive economy in terms of its financial reserves. It has a whacking great debt, about 243% of debt to GDP ratio, but over 90% of that debt is domestically owned. In other words, the Japanese can continue to borrow for themselves in order to finance that debt. How long they can do that is a worry, because while Japan was a trade surplus country, the need to reduce the level of debt could be postponed. But Japan is now moving into deficit territory, in large measure because the effect of the Fukushima nuclear reactor disaster was to reduce to nil the number of nuclear reactors that were online, which means that Japan has to import nearly all its energy, and this is having a terrible impact on its balance of payments. So Japan is moving into deficit territory. Its energy policy is dubious. Its industrial and economic force remains, as Roddy said, palpable. It's a major, major economy. And my message to all British companies who used to come to Japan was just to understand how enormous the Japanese economy was and how it still remains a benchmark for high quality. But at the same time, the terms of economic trade are turning against Japan over the longer term. which necessitates even more the radical policies which Abe has committed himself to, not only to deregulate, but also to try and tackle the debt mountain by beginning to increase VAT, which is very low in Japan, and stimulate corporate activity by reducing corporation tax, which is very high. So Abenomics, the jury is still out. We should not, I believe, ever leap to immediate conclusions that Japan is either feast or famine, but as an economic policy, the skeptics are beginning to have the upper hand, I think, in the public debate over its long-term effectiveness. Now, the political situation in Japan, as I indicated, is very complex. And I suppose one way into understanding that is to speculate a little on what role politicians have in Japan. I emphasize that because, in different countries, in Britain, in America, in Europe, in European countries, and in Japan, I think politicians have different roles. And I was never completely convinced when I was watching this as an ambassador that the politicians in Japan quite saw themselves as legislators and holders of the executive to account that politicians in the United Kingdom might. There was a sense that the model which had supported Japan very powerfully for 30, 40 years, which was called the Iron Triangle, this was the Liberal Democratic Party running parliament, big business dictating the terms of policies which would provide Japan with continued prosperity, and the bureaucracy delivering the administration of government which effectively delivered those policies, meant that politicians were required to oversee parliamentary business in support of that consensus's needs, but it was not a very highly developed political culture in terms of being accountable to individual voters or to the electorate at large. In the 1990s, that Iron Triangle began to break down. It broke down partly through massive examples of maladministration. There were serious scandals connected with infected blood and other serious governmental bungles. It broke down through corruption. Japanese politics had always been quite corrupt, and indeed previous prime ministers have had to stand down because of proven corruption. But now suddenly the corruption extended from politics to the bureaucracy, and that began to taint an institution which was regarded in Japan as extraordinarily powerful and effective. So the disillusion and disaffection with politics crept in. The most successful prime minister of the last 15 years was Junichiro Koizumi, who was the LDP prime minister in the first half of the last decade. And he was successful in the sense because he was a maverick from outside the system who almost came to power and ran as prime minister in the teeth of opposition from within his own party. So he was able, his brand was the outsider defying the political establishment. When he finally, he was prime minister for 5 years, it was a long time. In many countries, a very, very long time in Japan. When he finally stood down, we went into a period of revolving door prime ministers, one of whom was Abe. The DPJ were no better. Now Abe has come back to power, and he's been in power for nearly 2 years, and his popularity rating is quite high for a prime minister for a Japanese prime minister, because the normal syndrome is for prime ministers to come in with a post-election bounce, and then as soon as they have to start taking difficult and unpopular decisions, the slippery slope of unpopularity overwhelms them. Abe has kept afloat for much longer than any of his predecessors, and will, I think, stay afloat for some time longer, although he's beginning to be affected by, firstly, worries about Abenomics, secondly, unpopularity of some of his more nationalistic policies on the constitution, and thirdly, scandals have begun to get to him. He's lost 2 ministers this week in financial scandals, electoral funding scandals. So the political culture is not terribly powerful, and from time to time Japanese politicians would say what we really need is a political culture as you have in the UK, two strong political parties. We need to move to a culture where you have, the Conservatives versus Labour. Just as I explained to them, we were moving away from a culture of having two strong political parties, and an increasing proportion of people in the UK were no longer saw themselves as supporters of Conservative or Labour Party, and indeed that the disaffection from politics was affecting us and other European countries as much as Japan, but nonetheless many Japanese politicians still saw the UK as a sort of model for them. One of the factors which does affect Japan's profile in the world, I think, is a relatively high degree of linguistic isolation. And I mention this in the context of the politics because I think it affects politicians more than it affects many other groups. You will not find a large number of Japanese politicians who are confident in another language. Of course there are exceptions, there are a slightly increasing number of exceptions, but it is still the case that Japan in linguistic terms remains a country by itself. I had one Foreign Office minister visiting Japan, and I had my little dinner party where we talked through these issues, and he asked the question, what are the issues which are holding Japan back? And I blurted out in a rather undiplomatic way my concern that one of the issues in Japan which was serious for Japan as a society was the relatively poor level of spoken English at senior levels, throughout the society, but certainly at senior levels in politics, business and so forth. The minister reprimanded me for being rude and undiplomatic, but the Japanese around the table all agreed with me and said, you're quite right, this is a serious problem. It linked to the teaching of English in schools, and it contributes, I think, to a sense in which Japan, unlike many other countries in Asia, appears to be slightly at a tangent to the world of international organizations. Again, I'm generalizing because there have been some effective Japanese administrators in international organizations. There are highly effective Japanese diplomats. The Foreign Ministry is an impressive institution. There are international political commentators. There are academics working, particularly in American universities, but not to the degree or the strength in depth that you would expect a major industrial and financial economic force to have. And I think that is one of the underlying issues which I think presents Japan with a problem in terms of its profile. And maybe, because I don't want to get into too much detail on this while I talk, we can talk a little bit about that in questions and answers. Let me cover briefly the international and regional issues, because part of my thesis is that Japan's international profile is a little lower than it should be. Japan ought, by rights, to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. The British government has always strongly argued that the Security Council should be reformed, expanded, and that Japan and Germany and other countries as well, India, Brazil, perhaps South Africa, should join an enlarged Security Council. That is not going to happen in the near future, firstly because there isn't a consensus on how the Security Council should be reformed, but secondly because its relations with China have deteriorated extremely badly over the last 2 to 3 years. And it's worth just reminding oneself, as one just reflects on the deterioration of Sino-Japanese relations, that when I arrived as ambassador in 2008, immediately after the Sichuan earthquake, where there had been a considerable surge of sympathy in Japan, and Japan had offered assistance. It had not been able to give any military assistance, but it had nonetheless, it had been something of a bond between the two countries as China recovered from this disaster. It had had visits by the Premier and Prime Minister, President and Prime Minister of the People's Republic, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, very successful visits. There had been agreement that the relationship between Japan and China was strategic and beneficial. What happened to the relationship to sink so low as we see at the moment? In one sense, of course, the proximate cause of the deterioration of the relationship is the argument that is taking place over these islands which have been administered by Japan for over 120 years, but which are claimed by China, which are in the East China Sea, the Senkaku Islands. I'm not going to go into all the details of that dispute. It's incredibly complicated. I can cover some of this if people are interested in questions. The fundamental issue here is that China and Japan are two competing powers in East Asia, competing for influence, competing for economic impact, and competing, albeit in very different circumstances, for political and economic impact and influence as well. And China is the rising power and perceives Japan as the declining power. I'm presenting what is a rather Japan-centered analysis of this, and there may be people in the audience who want to redress the balance when we have questions. But in Japanese eyes, China has an ambition to extend its military and political influence beyond Japan into the Asia-Pacific region, to beyond the lines of islands. Japan is on the first island chain, Guam is on the second island chain, so as to challenge US military hegemony in Asia-Pacific and to drive an effective wedge between Japan, between the US and its allies, its chief ally being Japan. The relationship between China and Japan has deteriorated shockingly since the Senkaku issue blew up in 2012. There are signs at the moment in Japan, I was there 2 weeks ago, that the Japanese are a little more optimistic that something can be done to improve the relationship with China. The two leaders have to meet when there is the APEC summit in Beijing in a few weeks' time. And they see China's need for Japanese investment, because Japanese investment has fallen off quite sharply over the last 2 years because of the deterioration in political links, as helping to drive that improvement, if not rapprochement. Nonetheless, there is serious concern among all countries, that the two most powerful countries in Asia should be in this bitter debate, and that China's tendency to argue that the debate is all about Japan's unwillingness to accept the result of the war should be assisted in a way by the actions of some right-wing Japanese politicians in continuing to seek to revise and revisit the historical apologies which Japan made for its atrocities during the war in China and the East Asian Pacific War more generally. That historical revisionism which takes place in Japan is deeply unhelpful from the point of view of Japan's relations with its East Asian neighbours. Equally, one has to recognise that a fair amount of the historical arguments which are thrown at Japan by China and by Korea are thrown at Japan for political reasons rather than from a genuine sense of historical outrage. The Japanese feel reasonably confident that they can manage the relationship with China. They seem to be much more worried about how to cope with the relationship with Korea, where they are less clear what it is the Koreans wish them to do by way of making additional atonement, not only for Japan's actions during the war, but of course Japan's actions during the period of colonial rule of Korea, which goes back to 1910. And again, this issue is not helped by some ultra-right-wing Japanese tendency to downplay the terrible crimes that were committed to women who were coerced into prostitution by the Japanese Imperial Army. At the same time, with the Korean government now beginning to target Japanese journalists for alleged criminal libel against Korean politicians, the relationship between the two countries seems to be entering an even more neuralgic phase. So these two relations are very poor. And this is bad because there ought to be, a much more cohesive attempt to engage with China as China rises to a position of high political and economic influence in the world, not just in Asia. And secondly, to tackle the threat posed by the rogue state of North Korea, whose regular missile satellite launches threaten Japanese territory as well as South Korean territory. Japan and Korea, US's two major allies in East Asia, ought not to be at loggerheads. The United States alliance remains the cornerstone of Japanese economic and political security. And I always felt, when I was British ambassador, that I had very, very good, close relations with my superb American colleagues. I always felt that the relationship between the US and Japan was in another league from the relationship between Japan and any other of its friends and allies. The US is, in a sense, the prism through which Japan sees so much of its international policy. And like all such relationships, there's tension and resentment as well as dependence and neediness. So it's a very complex relationship. But I don't myself, I'm not saying this in any sense as a neoconservative. I'm not a neocon in any way, but I don't myself see any alternative at the moment, given the absence of effective regional organizations to deal with these complex security issues, to the United States remaining the guarantor of effective security in Northeast Asia, as the role that it currently plays. Europe and the UK. Well, the UK we were privileged to have a very strong relationship with Japan for many years, and that relationship really began to improve and come to fruition, I think, in the 1980s, when we were, the then government, building on the success of the Heath and Wilson governments, but particularly under Mrs. Thatcher, began the process of bringing more Japanese investment into all parts of the UK. Many distinguished Japanese companies established themselves in Scotland, as you will know. And Japan's tremendous contribution to British prosperity through its investment and trading links became more apparent. And we invested a lot of time as a government in securing that sense of partnership in Japan, not just on economic issues, but on a broader range of political and international and regional issues, as Japan came out of its shell and became more diplomatically active in the world, and I think that has borne successful fruit. I'm going to make 2 points which are very political, I'm going to talk about 2 political issues at this stage, which I'd be happy to pick up on questions and answers. One is Japanese concern about the possibility that Britain might, at some future date, withdraw from the European Union. I cannot stress too much the extent to which this is watched closely in Japan by Japanese government, by Japanese companies. When I was ambassador in 2012, and David Cameron wrote his article for the Sunday Telegraph, which he wrote as a leader of the Conservative Party, not as Prime Minister, about the need to have a referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. It appeared on a Sunday, obviously, in the UK that night. Only a few hours after it had appeared, I was at a dinner with some Japanese bankers. I was quizzed relentlessly on precisely what this meant. Britain as a centre for Japanese investment, Britain as a participant in the single market, and Britain as an influential player in Europe, influencing Europe on issues like free trade agreements. This is fundamental for Japan as a major contributor to British prosperity. So there is concern which the Japanese tend not to express too overtly, because they don't, I think, want to put their heads too far above the parapet on difficult political issues, but it is there all the time, and we just need to be aware of that as we engage in the public debate on Britain in Europe, which is beginning to assume momentum as we get closer to the British general election. And the same could be said about the fascination of Japan, Japanese officials and Japanese companies in the run-up to the Scottish referendum last month. I certainly spent a lot of time talking to Japanese companies who support the Japan Society, the Japanese Embassy, about speaking as a British observer of the Scottish referendum, of the meaning of the referendum and the implications of the various courses of action. And the leap in the Tokyo Stock Exchange the day after the referendum result tells you something about the sense of about the Japanese attitudes, the attitudes of a major investor to perceived instability and uncertainty in one of Japan's major trading and investment partners. So my theme there is just to emphasize how much what happens in Britain is of interest way outside our shores, and particularly to a country like Japan, which is so much of whose European strategy, and all these companies, incidentally, manage all their Middle East and African business from London or wherever they are in the UK, is bound up in the UK and the UK's future. Well, as British ambassador, I was proud of the achievement over many years of building that relationship. It contributes 130,000 jobs directly to the British economy, hundreds of thousands more in the supply chains, and who knows how much money in terms of prosperity for Britain. So it's a precious success story, which I certainly want to, in my retirement as a diplomat, now operating in various organisations and commercially, want to support. So I've talked, I hope, Roddy, in rather general terms about Japan's role in the world. And I suppose my fundamental theme is, even though we are rightly now mesmerised by the rapid growth of China and the future of China as China changes as a society as well as grows as an economy, even though we are looking at the fast-growing economies in the industrialising world in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere in Asia, let's remember Japan, which remains a giant in economic terms and will remain a giant, however much the relativities change, during the rest of our professional and personal lifetimes. And remember that it remains a friend of Britain and a friend and a country with whom our friendship and close relationship has borne serious fruit over the past 30 years. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to answer questions.
Well, Sir David, thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating overview and discussion of Japan and its role in the 21st century. Two of the three musketeers are now coming to grab these. Here you go, guys. Let's check they're on. Could I just kick off by asking you a question about a topic you haven't covered on, which is Japan positioning itself in the external world with all these threats from a defence standpoint? As an ex-military man, we know that enshrined in the Japanese constitution is the concept of defence. But many military people would say that with what's going on at the moment, there could be an argument that Japan's position as a military force perhaps should change. Do you have any observations on that?
Yes, no, thank you, Roddy, for asking that question, which perhaps I ought to have covered. Preface it by saying, however much we think Japan's international profile is lower than it should be, it is a major aid donor, and it is a major defence spender, because it's spending on defence. I think it is the sixth largest spender on defence, after the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And for the last 20 or so years, Japanese troops, who of course are notionally self-defence forces, have taken an important role in United Nations peacekeeping activities. So Japan is involved in United Nations peacekeeping, but the Constitution of Japan, Article 9 of the Constitution, which was written by the Americans in 1947-48, commits Japan to pacifism and to forces which are for self-defence use only. Now, Abe wishes to amend the Constitution so as to allow Japan to participate in collective self-defence, so that it can, which it can't at the moment, effectively go to the rescue or to the assistance of the Americans if the Americans are attacked in the region, which the Constitution currently prohibits. This is not, as some critics of Japan have said, carte blanche to enable Japan to wage war on foreign soil. This is nonsense. This is a very specific entitlement for Japan to do what every other country in the world can do, which is to help support its ally where Japanese nationals, Japanese territory is threatened. And even this constitutional change, it's not a sort of formal amendment, it's a reinterpretation of the Constitution, is quite controversial in Japan because, as I used to argue very strongly with London on, pacifism runs deep in Japan. The centre of gravity, I believe, in Japanese society and Japanese politics remains pacific, traumatised by the horrors of the Second World War. And this amendment to the or interpretation of the Constitution, which I think we should support. I mean, certainly if I were in government still, I would be arguing for the British government to support this, and I think in broad terms we do, remains quite controversial in Japan. I think it will ultimately go through, although pushing it effectively through is taking up quite a bit of Abe's political capital. But you're right, we would like to see Japan play a greater role in terms of contributing more to the security of the region and the world more generally. And Abe, who is of course a prime minister who is very much from what one might describe as the more nationalist, defence-orientated wing of the party, would like to do this and would like Britain to be one of the countries with whom Japan partners in that.
Thank you. Now Q&A from the floor. Could you just say who you are, the gentleman at the back please, when asking a question, and perhaps very kindly ask a question rather than make a statement, if you see what I mean. Thank you. First question.
Thank you very much, Sir David, for a very interesting talk. My name is Colin Donald. I'm from the Sunday Herald newspaper. You've raised the point about the generally low standards of English, and I just wanted to ask, according to the sort of theme of isolation, relative isolation that you began your talk with, do you think that steps are being taken to improve that, effective steps? And also, slightly associated, does Japan have an immigration policy that will allow workers from outside the region to come in and perhaps mitigate some of the demographic challenges that the country faces?
Well, two very good questions, thank you. Firstly, addressing the deficiency in English. I simplified in my talk. I think it's more than just English. I will answer your question, but it's more than just English. It was a sort of turning away from international engagement. One of the themes that I noticed when I was ambassador were older Japanese saying, why are our younger children, grandchildren, why don't they want to travel abroad? Why don't they want to study abroad? The number of Japanese studying abroad had gone down quite sharply. They seem to have lost their interest and curiosity. When we were young, in the period after the war, we wanted to get abroad to New York, Washington, London, Paris. Our current generation doesn't seem to want to do so. Don't seem to want to work in the same degree for foreign multinational companies. One big multinational company said to me, you know, in any other country in the world, offering an international business career would be a positive advantage, but in Japan it seems to be a disincentive to getting the quality of management we want. These are straws in the wind which suggest among the present generation of young people in Japan a certain kind of inward-lookingness. This is how the Japanese themselves describe it. I think the quality of English is an aspect of that, because English tends to be taught in Japanese schools very much as some of us learnt Latin and Greek, ancient Greek, a sort of dead language that you could read on the page, but which you would not necessarily be expected to use in speaking or interacting with people. And it affects also, I believe, the quality of Japanese universities. If you look at the league tables, I'm now in this world as a chair of a council of a British university. You don't find many Japanese, you find about 2 Japanese universities in the top 100. And, you know, there ought to be more. Japan is a centre of learning in many areas, and yet the number of citations of Japanese in Japanese papers is relatively low for a highly developed and highly intelligent, you know, sort of a group of people. Part of that is English, and the Japanese government are committed to internationalising universities through an aggressive policy of trying to develop 10, 12 universities into the top 100 of universities, and putting a lot of money behind universities that teach in English or have concrete plans to teach their students English so that they can operate effectively. Some Japanese companies, the more innovative companies like Rakuten, the e-retailing company, English is now the language that they use in their daily work, in Japan as well as around the world. Fast Retailing, which is another major innovative Japanese company whom we know in the UK as Uniqlo, the retailer, English is the language of the company. So there are examples of companies and government policies to support education that are trying to tackle this question. So it's perceived as a serious issue. Immigration, I think that is I think it is recognised as a subject which needs to be tackled. But I don't sense at the moment in the Japanese government that it is the highest priority. Certainly, getting women into the workforce in larger numbers is a higher priority for Abe, and Abe has committed himself and is challenging companies to promote women to the board. Japan is a very patriarchal society. Again, this is a wild simplification because I could talk all night about gender roles in Japan, and we must not be sucked into simply thinking that Japanese women are in any way submissive and that feminism passed Japan by, but as measured in the number of Japanese women working at senior levels in politics, in the bureaucracy, in business, in the media, it simply doesn't compare with other developed countries. And so, improving that record is the highest priority for Abe, which is why he's so embarrassed by the fact that 2 of his 5 women ministers in the cabinet had to resign this week. Immigration, yes, there are policies to bring healthcare workers from Indonesia, from the Philippines, to deal with the issue of a large number of older people. But I don't think there is quite the same momentum in Japanese political terms behind the need to move on immigration as there is on the need to move on gender and changing Japan's business model in those terms.
Lady in the middle, and then a gentleman here in the front afterwards.
Hello, my name's Kate Thompson Katagiri, and I know Sir David from when I was living in Japan. I lived there for over 17 years, and I have 2 half-Japanese British children. And actually, going on from Colin's question about immigration, you were saying there's an ageing demographic, and with the language skills, it would surely make logical sense to accept dual nationality. Do the government, are they taking this seriously at all, or are they considering it?
Well, Kate, I'm not an expert on this. I suspect the answer, I don't know if we have the Japanese Consul General here this evening. I know he's joining us later. He would perhaps be able to answer the question. My guess is that they are not. I think the concept of dual nationality is very difficult for Japan, as it is for some other countries. You are either one nationality or you are another nationality. A descriptor which brings kind of ambiguity into the relationship with the state is quite complex, I think, and I don't see that there is any serious thinking at the moment going on in Japan. I stand to be corrected if someone knows more than I do, but I suspect you would know more than I do, and I don't think that there is much support for this.
But you might have some.
No, I don't, I'm afraid. I think, one has to. Let me just answer that and the previous question in a little more detail. The political sensitivity of this, of course, in Japan is that Japan has a very low level of immigration. It's about 1% of the population was born outside Japan, and the vast majority of that 1% will be Chinese and Koreans. And when you go to Tokyo and you see the ultra-rightists, collecting signatures outside the Yasukuni Shrine against the civic rights of foreigners being allowed to vote in municipal elections and so forth, it's the Chinese and Koreans that they're aiming at. This is the kind of palatable fringe of a very nasty ultra-right-wing movement, which is directed specifically at foreigners, which is manifesting itself in some parts of Japan at the moment in hate crimes. Immigration, the immigration debate is focused around very different issues from the sort of immigration debate I suspect that we would understand in Britain or in other European countries. These issues are, I think, kind of bound up in the Japanese government's response. I think the government recognise that they need to be more open to immigrants. There is no appetite for a radical solution to this question at the moment.
Gentleman here in the front.
Thank you. It was a really interesting talk. So I'm Michael Klauser, an academic entrepreneur. And I just wanted to get your comments about a force that could tie the region together, but also some of the limitations I understand about Japan. And the force is innovation and creativity. It's something that especially the younger generation share. They, for example, one of my former students, she went up and she's teaching entrepreneurship in North Korea through a nonprofit organization because there's such a huge interest amongst young people. And we see now the young and innovative in Hong Kong, protesting what they perceive as an anti-democratic wave. And we also have, a lot of entrepreneurs in Korea and they're, working on things like, music video and robotics and so on. And so it's really a force. The creativity and innovation they're not finite resources, but there are a lot of constraints now that are put on by government. So there's regulation, there's surveillance. I mean, the younger generation, they don't want to be spied on. They want Ed Snowden to be free, and they also want to have the ability to use cryptocurrency and transact online using Dogecoin, for example. And so during my MBA, my entrepreneurship professor, he used to consult with the government of Japan, especially on venture capital policy.
Sorry, you have a question?
Yes, I do. So one of his thesis was that the capital structures of Japan were geared towards big manufacturing and not the knowledge economy, not the entrepreneurial economy, and that limited the supply of risk capital, which basically limited the supply of innovative ventures. And there was also a structural problem with the equity markets themselves at the Tokyo Exchange, and because there was a trust factor. So I'm wondering if you can comment on the supply of risk capital, venture capital policy in Japan, and also how that relates to the capital markets and the country's ability to create risk capital, which the young innovators need to grow new ventures and new disruptive technologies and things that will replace the old industrial economy, which Japan seems to be stuck to.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not an expert on venture capital. Japan does not lack innovators, and it does not lack risk capital venture financiers. But it is certainly true that what we would understand as the high level of creative destruction, which is implicit in capitalist structures, that what Schumpeter talks about, is foreign, I think, to the Japanese business model. Japan remains a very risk-averse country. The reason that there are so many regulations is because Japan wants, and here I'm generalizing, Japanese companies, the Japanese, want to take risk out of the equation as much as they can in order to avoid, or at least to strictly manage risk as effectively as possible. And that is why, the successive Japanese governments make bonfires of regulations which seem to us quite ridiculous in terms of their restriction of certain ways of conducting transactions, but which are logical to Japanese companies. I used to find this, to go from the general to a specific, every time I went into a Japanese bank to make a bank transfer and had to sign 2 pages of documentation to explain that, this was going to a legitimate a recipient. I had to explain what the recipient was. I had to say it wasn't going to Iran, it wasn't going to North Korea, it wasn't going into money laundering or drug trafficking. I had to sign all these documentation. I mean, this is something we can do in the UK, effortlessly across the counter, is done in Japan in a much more complex way. Now, that's the sort of regulation which is sort of being removed. The stock market in Japan, you have to remember that there are still a large number of Japanese companies who do not regard themselves as bound by the interests of their shareholders. They are bound by the interests of their employees, of the family that owns them, of the other companies that are dependent upon them. In one sense, this is a very attractive business model because it is a model which is linked to the needs of society. It is not the sort of business model that we recognize in terms of shareholders holding Japanese companies rigorously to account for effective governance or poor management. This was at the heart of the Olympus scandal, which some of you will have read about. Michael Woodford, who was the British CEO of Olympus, a major and deeply respected Japanese company, who discovered that illegal activities had gone on, sought to expose them, was sacked by his board, and ultimately he failed to get his company back, but he did expose the board, and they are now suffering criminal sanction. So we're talking about a very different model of business. And again, the Japanese government, the Japanese authorities, the Japanese finance world recognize the need to change this business model and to tackle these issues and to improve governance so that it moves a little bit more towards the sort of risk venture model that you refer to. But there are venture capitalists in Japan, and there are innovators like Mikitani of Rakuten, who are profoundly frustrated by the sclerotic old boys of the Japanese industrial system and are leaving those groupings in order to set up their own models, and who are, in a sense, models for a younger generation of Japan. So my theme would be to say, my message is that Japan is a more diverse country and that change is happening.
We'll take two questions. Gentleman here and then the gentleman at the back. So, yeah, first. And then Ed at the back. Yeah.
Thank you, Sir David. It's Cameron from University of Edinburgh. Just following on from your previous statement, comments about Japan being risk averse. Arguably, the Bank of Japan, as you mentioned, is being quite risky with the monetary stimulus that it's applying with government debt over 200%, and it's adding more. In fact, it's the only country really that's adding in any large amount right now. There's scholarly hypothesis at the moment that this could lead to hyperinflation in a few years' time if it all goes wrong, which could derail Japan's place in the 21st century as part of your speech today. Just wondering about your views upon this effort by the Japanese government and the Bank of Japan in terms of its reflationary risky policies.
So David, could we take the second
Yeah,
one as well?
sure.
To the back.
Thank you. My name's Ed Thompson from the Asia Scotland Institute. I had the pleasure of working under David's leadership for a number of years in Japan. David, you talked a little bit earlier about, in terms of English language teaching, the anxiety felt in Japan about the drift away from the kind of international conversation, international community. But also about some of the energy and resource that's being put in to try and address that. I wonder if you see other aspects of education or the economy or other areas in Japanese society where if one lifts the lid, it's possible to find areas where there is an enthusiasm for engagement on the Japanese part and as an opportunity for a country like the UK to meet them halfway to address some kind of need. I wonder if you could comment on perhaps some of the sort of less obvious opportunities for engagement with Japan for mutual benefit.
So solving two challenges.
Yes.
Financial and
Well, I mean, firstly on the Bank of Japan, I really am very sceptical about the possibility of hyperinflation in Japan. I'm terribly sceptical. I mean, the issue in Japan is deflation. You know, the prices have been stuck for the last 20, 25 years. Indeed, the problem is, in a sense, it's not. It's deflationary. It's wage deflation. The problem is that prices have not risen and wages have not risen. VAT in Japan was 5%. It's now 8%. It should rise to 10% next year. Even those small increases are a little alarming for Japanese consumers, and demand falls off immediately. The problem in Japan is that people are not spending. You know, the money is going under the bed, in the safe, and Japan is still quite a heavily cash society. You know, the proportion of cash, I forget the percentage, is much higher than for most other developed economies. It's now more of a credit card society than it was when I lived there in the 1990s. In many respects, you know, it's not a society of share owners. This is part of the aim of the Bank of Japan, is to get more people buying stocks and shares. But, you know, the proportion of Japanese who've never bought a stock and share is very, very high. So in many respects, the business model is very different. And, you know, in a sense, we're caught between saying, well, it's different, and obviously, you know, Japan should want to be like the rest of the world, but Japanese are saying, but do we want quite to be like the rest of the world? Don't we want to retain some of the uniqueness of Japan, which it may mean that our economy is stagnating, but it does mean that our society is still stable. You know, that's the sort of conundrum, I think, which is in the Japanese mind. So the prospect of hyperinflation, I think, is deeply, I would say, is deeply unlikely. But you're right, of course, you know, ultimately the debt has to be addressed, because ultimately Japan will not be in a position to continue to borrow from itself. Having said that, people were saying that when I was in Japan, and I arrived in Japan in 2008, they said in 2 or 3 years' time Japan will have to tackle this issue. Well, we're now 6 years on, and Japan is slowly beginning to tackle the issue. One of the things which I think frustrates commentators about Japan is Japan's refusal to obey, apparently, to obey the laws of gravity, economic gravity. And you know, I noticed among some of the Western commentators on Japan a profound frustration that Japan didn't collapse like we said it was going to collapse. It seems to stay afloat. Well, it does stay afloat. That's because it's a highly innovative society with strong centres of excellence in certain manufacturing and rather fewer service industries, but nonetheless strong centres of excellence, albeit now offshoring, you know, to foreign investment centres, a strong and socially cohesive community, and it doesn't simply crumple. You know, it's with no disrespect to what people were saying about Greece, it's not a Greece, you know, and so people who say something terrible is going to happen are often wrong about Japan. It sounds very complacent to say that, but that's my view. On Ed's question about areas of cooperation, you know, I'm going to ramble slightly, Ed, because you know there are lots and lots of areas, as you will know from your work in Osaka with science and innovation, where you know Japan is looking for partnerships with British scientists, with British engineers, with British innovators. We were particularly keen, for example, as Japan tackles the issue of restarting its nuclear reactors, deeply unpopular in a country which is seismologically very sensitive, and particularly after the disaster at Fukushima. We hoped that UK nuclear expertise, not just technological but also in the governance of nuclear, might help provide some of the solutions to the dilemmas which Japan was addressing. So nuclear is one area. As Japan becomes more defence-orientated, that too is an area where we might begin to establish some closer relationships, although we accept that Japan's perspective on its defence relationship is going to be heavily driven by the United States of America. I would like British universities to engage more with Japan in the higher educational sector as Japan begins the internationalization of its higher education. The problem, I have to say, and I say this really for Japanese members of the audience, is that it's still quite a slow process to elicit from Japanese universities that sort of sense of joint purpose that you get much more easily in China, in Brazil, and in India. Nobody's asked about visas this evening. Visas are not a major issue, I think, British visas this is, for Japan, not least because when I was ambassador, and my successor does the same, we spent a lot of time going through all the visa regulations with our inward investors and our higher education organisations to make sure they understood exactly what they had to do so that they would do it effectively. But I do believe, which is why I'm associated with Migration Matters, as Roddy said, that the government's immigration policy is having a deterrent effect on effective bringing in students from abroad, and also it has a longer-term deterrent effect on the sort of international partnerships in industry that we want to encourage. And my final point on its question is, there is an enormous area of soft power. We don't really talk about it because it's below the radar screen for middle-aged diplomats. But British music, very big in Japan. Japanese manga, cartoons, Japanese anime. This is the model for a younger generation of people who are becoming Japanophiles. Japanese popular culture, enormously influential across Asia. Whatever tensions there are in the relationship between Japan and Korea at the moment politically, and in terms of people-to-people contacts, it's J-pop, Japanese pop groups, who are big in Korea. but less big worldwide than, for example, Rapper Psy and his Gangnam Style. The Koreans have kind of tapped into that worldwide, viral sense of popular culture much more effectively. So maybe there are some things we can do there. But I was always very diffident about attempting to suggest that I was an expert on this question, which I am not.
We'll take one last question from the gentleman in the lumberjack shirt there. Is that right? Yep. The forestry shirt, and then we're going to repair after I thank Sir David next door, where you can talk about Gangnam Style to your heart's content. Yes, sir.
Right. Thank you, Sir David, for your talk. Vanya Skonskas, also from the University of Edinburgh. I was wondering, first of all, did you hear of the JET program?
Yes. I should have mentioned it. Yeah.
So that's one thing I'm applying to as I'm a fourth year, so I'm applying to the JET program,
Yes.
but I'm American, as you can probably tell, so I'm applying through the U.S. Embassy. I just want to touch upon the thing you talked about earlier with more of like the ignorance of maybe international culture, maybe the English language. Because the JET program is pretty old, has it had any effect on Japanese youth, like giving them exposure to the English language and just American, British culture in general?
Well, thank you so much for mentioning the JET program, which I ought to have mentioned. It's a fantastic program. This program is now, in one form or another, it's nearly 40 years old. And it's a program which brings young teachers of English from around the world to Japan, and they go and live and work in a Japanese school, in a high school, for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. I mean, I met some British Jets who'd been there for 5 years, but it's unusual to stay quite so long. But they stay a long time. And it gives them a wonderful exposure to Japanese education, to Japanese society, to Japanese culture, Japanese life. It may be in a high school in an urban area like Tokyo or Osaka, or Fukuoka or Sapporo. It may be in an isolated rural area. But I've never met anybody coming off the JET program who hasn't spoken very warmly of the extraordinary experience which it's given them. And it's often the beginning of a lifelong commitment to the relationship with Japan. It's a very, very effective example of soft power diplomacy. And I've always said at public meetings where Japanese government are present, this is one of the most successful examples in the world of a government investing in the next generation of leaders effectively and creating this sense of common purpose. It's very, very powerful. The slight problem with the JET program is the numbers have gone down over the years, and one of the reasons it's quite an expensive program. The Jets get quite well recompensed, rightly so, for the expertise they bring. And it's an in-depth recruitment process. And the quality of Jets, I always felt, British Jets I met, was very, very high. But it's quite expensive. And so for local authorities, it's sometimes been a little bit less attractive than some of the cheaper, but perhaps less effective English language training programs, which are commercially available. But it's a great example of how the next generation can learn effectively about Japan. So very good luck for your application.
There, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, it's ended, but it's not ended because you can catch Sir David outside over a glass of wine. And why I want to break now is to give more people a chance to talk to him. And the gentleman raising his hand, I think, has a chance to talk to him later on anyway. So I'd like to thank you, Sir David, very much for really opening up, perhaps in a way that those first ships did, after Japan had been closed to the rest of the world for so long, opening up to us here tonight a lot of very interesting, fundamental observations about the complexity, the attraction, and the opportunities for those that take the time to understand Japanese culture, for young people and business people of all ages to engage with a fascinating and extremely important market. So thank you for coming and addressing very clearly the issues relating to Japan's place in the 21st century. Thank you, audience, for coming. And so we certainly hope to see you here again, and I certainly hope to see most of the audience at our next events that are coming up, which are on the website. So thank you very much. And thank you finally to ICAS, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, to whom we are very grateful for helping make this evening happen. And to Athol, who's their leader, who's there in the middle. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir David.
Thank you so much.